All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. If you are watching me live or if you are watching the recording here, thank you for taking the time to tune into the show. We're getting new viewers here every single day, so if you are watching this for the first time, this is a live Q&A style show where I answer questions from our users about SaberSim, about DFS. We talk strategy, we do product demos and more instructional stuff of how to use the tool, really whatever you guys want to talk about. I host this show live for a reason. I want follow-up questions and clarifying questions. I want you guys to really be a part of the conversation here. So as I'm talking through things today or any day, always feel free to ask any clarifying questions you have if I'm talking about something that doesn't make any sense, or if you have 2 cents that you want to add to the conversation, always feel free to shout it out. The best places to do that, as always, are in either YouTube chat here or in the Office Hours channel on Slack. If you are not already in our Slack community, I highly recommend joining up. That's where all these conversations start. There's a lot of interesting follow-up coming out of these videos and just great conversation going on every day in Slack. When this video is up as a recording on YouTube here, the description of the video always has a link to join our Slack community. If you'd like to join any of my past Office Hours videos as well, we'll already have that link in the description if you'd like to join up. Let's see. I mentioned I host the show every single day, Monday through Friday, once a week. It's typically Thursdays, but we've been mixing in some Wednesdays here based on schedules. We use this time slot for what we've been calling a strategy session, where I'm typically joined by a couple other members of the SaberSim team, and we dive deep into a specific DFS concept or sport type or contest type. We've already gotten through quite a few of those now. Those videos are also all up on our YouTube channel. Definitely recommend checking them out. But in particular, if you have been playing baseball DFS this season, the last series of 2 or 3 of those strategy sessions, I think, are very helpful for your baseball DFS process. A couple weeks ago, we had Matt and Will on here talking about the improvements we've made to the baseball model this season and overall just a bit how that baseball model works. And then last week, we had Max and Andy on here, and we were talking about I think we called it 5 styles or strategies for building winning DFS lineups, really just breaking down different ways that you can add value by editing projections or exposures or ownership to your DFS process. And then yesterday, Max was on here with me yesterday talking about finding the right stacks for baseball DFS. So those last 2 videos in particular, I think, work really well together, treating the 5 strategies of winning DFS players. I can't remember the exact titles of those videos, but the one from 2 weeks ago with the 5 strategies, almost more as a how to add value, what are the best ways to go about adding value to your process. And then yesterday's video, I think, works a little bit better as a why to that how. Why would I want to go in and change projections on a certain player? How can I use SaberSim as a research tool to learn a little more about the slate and find my particular opportunities to add value, either in finding leverage of low-owned stacks or editing your exposures or things like that. So if you've been playing a lot of baseball DFS like I have, I really highly recommend checking those videos out. The one question I have here today in my queue so far is, I think, a little bit of a follow-up to both of those videos. So I'm going to answer it from the perspective that you've kind of seen those videos and trying to merge those 2 ideas presented there together. But I see one other question popped in here, so we'll get to everything today. But this is a day where I expect to have quite a bit of time to answer whatever questions you guys want. So if you have questions, if you've been waiting for an opportunity to fire a question away, this is a good day for it. We've got plenty of time to talk about things. I think I'll probably spend a little bit longer on questions today here because I've got the time for it. And I will go ahead and just jump right into it. So first things first, I'm going to go ahead and pull up the app here, and we will start talking about it here. All right, cool. And let's go ahead and dive into the first question. Okay, so this came in from Shiver Me Ginger here early this morning, and he said, "Hi guys, just watched the last office hours. There was talk about if you are looking at the chalk, say Toronto today, that was yesterday, as a stack, you need to be different. You could, as suggested on stream, increase bat percent in lower orders of the batting order, not top end, etc. In the runs I've done, Scherzer is in 100% of lineups, who is going to be 60% owned. How do you go about making some of the lineups without Scherzer? If you highlight Toronto stacks, you cannot change exposure of individual pitchers and bats. When you have Toronto filtered as a stack, is the only way to do this to rerun a build without Scherzer. So this is a great question. Again, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this here today, talk about a few different opportunities of ways you can handle this kind of question through the lens of the 5 strategies that we talked about 2 weeks ago in the strategy session, right? So the way I'm reading this question, this is very much Shiver Me Ginger here has identified Scherzer's going to be very chalky tonight, and Toronto's probably going to be very chalky as well. And how do I deal with that, right? I still need to find leverage spots. I don't want to build lineups that are overly too chalky. And what's the best way to go about that? So I think as a good starting point here, let's just run a test build, see what we're kind of getting. Again, this is always a great way to start your process every day. So I'm just going to run default settings 20 max and go ahead. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and change my projections here before I build. This is always, I recommend most of our users to do their projection editing here before the build. It will avoid that DK community guidelines message from showing up at all on step 3 here. So we'll go ahead and let this build and get an idea of what SaberSim likes here, middle of the day. I think Shiver Me Ginger is right here that it's probably going to be a lot of Scherzer in Toronto. And we'll talk about ways you can maybe kind of deal with that. And then we'll wrap back around to a couple features that we're expecting to release in the near future for the app that I think will make this a little bit easier. So let's go ahead and see what we are getting. I see a couple other questions have rolled in on YouTube from Jeff and Edward here. Welcome, guys. Thank you for tuning into the stream here. So let's go ahead and take a look. So you can see we are not getting 100% Scherzer, but we are getting a lot of Scherzer, and we are also getting a ton of Toronto, right? So right off the bat, it's always, I think, good to just take a look at what some of these lineups actually look like. And see, so you can see we are getting a lot of Toronto, 100% Toronto stacks, but only 60% of our 5 stacks. And we're mixing in teams that I assume at the moment today, we're going to think are fairly less chalky. You see, we've got actually a Baltimore 5 stack here, which we assume are going to be a little less chalky. Let's go ahead and look at just our Toronto 5 stacks and get an idea. And again, talking about some of the same themes we talked about from yesterday, the builder with the default settings here with ownership, fade at a moderate or so level is going to start to handle some of this for you, right? We have lineups here where we have, let's actually look at our Toronto 5 stacks plus Scherzer, which are 8 different lineups. And you can see it's going to find opportunities to differentiate by using Baltimore smaller stacks, which are going to be probably a little bit less owned. Looks like a lot of Baltimore. And I think, yeah, so that's kind of the way that the builder is finding leverage out of the gate. But let's say now that this is a little bit too much exposure to those 2 independently chalky pieces, right? You're not comfortable going in with 8 lineups of your 20 that feature what we expect to be the chalkiest pitcher and the chalkiest stack. This is where I would recommend going back to that video, 5 strategies of winning DFS players. I wish I had I should know the exact title of that video, and start thinking about what are the strategies that you think really makes sense to deal with this problem, right? One of them that we discussed is working around ownership. And Shiver Me Ginger actually in his message here said that he's expecting Scherzer to be 60% owned. And I think that is definitely possible. I think we've seen this happen here on a lot of baseball slates so far this season, where the presumed best pitching option on the slate ends up getting a little bit out of control on ownership, maybe exceeding what we are expecting. And I think one thing that you can do right off the bat, again, referencing a strategy that we talked about in that video, is up Scherzer's ownership. Maybe we even put him at something like 65 if we think his ownership is going to get that high. And try another build and see if that starts having the impact that we might expect, where the value of ownership fade starts to shine here, and we may be able to get a little less access or a little less lineups with Scherzer. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like. And we'll let this build. We're going to be running a few different builds here because I want to show off a few different strategies. So, and I think the value of going this method, again, talking about those strategies here, is that it's very easy for us as humans here to predict human behavior, assume that we're going to have a certain ownership or a certain amount of people are going to use Scherzer in their lineups. And you see we already dropped down to just 45%, 9 lineups total with Scherzer here. We get a little more access to Tyler Mahle, who is likely to probably, if Scherzer does come in at this ownership, is likely to be even a little bit less owned than we predict. And it's having the effect that we assumed was going to happen here, right? We got a little less Scherzer overall. We probably still have quite a few Toronto bats. And we can go ahead and take a look at what some of these lineups look like. They're probably going to be pretty similar, I guess, right? We're still getting a lot of Baltimore, but now we've only got 2 lineups here where we're actually stacking Toronto and Scherzer together, right? As a 5-stack, right? Toronto as a 5-stack. There's probably a little bit more if we allowed this to just look at. Right, so we still have 9 different lineups where we're using Toronto stacks at all, but we are using... But we've only got two lineups where we're using a Toronto 5-stack plus Scherzer. And then talking about maybe a strategy that we learned in yesterday's video, a way to get some value out of editing your exposures here. We talked yesterday about instead limiting your minor stacks to a certain team. The main reason being is that if Toronto's the chalkiest team on the slate and you roster them in a 3-stack, even if the 3 guys that you roster all go off, they provide a lot of opportunities to other popular players that are in the lineup that 5-stacked them, right? So one thing Max and I talked about is you can find some leverage on the field or create the highest upside lineups possible by removing some of your minor stacks of the chalky team. So let's go ahead and remove Toronto. And now we can take a look at what this looks like, right? So now we've got 7 Scherzer lineups. Let's filter by Scherzer. And we've got 5 total lineups here. It actually looks like it went up. We got access to a little bit more Toronto, but 5 stacks by limiting our 3 stacks. But you can see how we are kind of starting to build a process here, right? Of the way of stepping through this. We identified 2 chalky components. We reduced our exposure to a pitcher by raising his ownership to just what we expect the field to do. And we got a little bit less access to that player. So that's a great way to use that strategy. I think you could even go a little bit further by starting to edit your projections of a certain player, right? If we wanted to even get a little bit less Scherzer here, or let's actually take this the other direction, right? Maybe we want to play more on the underside of those Toronto bats, right? That game, I think, has some weather concerns, if I'm not mistaken, as well. So maybe we want to just try to start limiting some of our exposure to the Toronto bats. A really easy way to do that is to edit the projections. So maybe let's go ahead and bring this down. One thing I like to do, there's 2 ways to kind of think about this when you're reducing the team totals. One way I like to do this is to bring them down to the next highest projected team, right? We're saying, okay, no, we're not going to treat Toronto as far and away the best team on the slate, but we're going to treat them as still tied with the next best team, right? And you can see that actually brings down the run total quite a bit here. Another way of thinking about it is allowing the team that is a favorite in the game to remain a favorite. So you can sometimes drop that down to just 5.1. So they are still considered the favorite in the way we're handling projections. But let's go ahead and apply the changes, right? And the nice thing about doing it this way here is that we're going to allow the ripple effects of editing those projections take place in the rest of our player projections, right? If we look, I actually think Baltimore is using kind of a bullpen type game tonight. It looks like we do have Aiken, but you can see Aiken's projection has gone up a little bit. The Toronto players, actually the easier way to do this is to filter here. And you can see a lot of the Toronto bats will have dropped down, some of these rather significantly. And there's actually sometimes a ripple effect overall on the other team, their projections as well, based on the game simulations that we are leveraging for our projections here, right? So we're starting to put together the pieces. We're building out our process here a little bit. Let's run another build and now see what this looks like. So we've increased the projection on what we think the highest owned player on the slate is going to be in the form of Scherzer. We've dropped down the Toronto bats down to the next highest team, which we have as the Twins right now at 5.3 runs. I think at this point, we might be approaching maybe a build that we're ready to actually use and dial in the exposures here, and actually could end up being the lineups that we run. So let's look at what this looks like and figure this out here. And this is really what I mean by saying those two videos that I'm mentioning here. They really come together, right? We have an image of how we want to tackle the slate, and we have the tools to execute that by adding value on the app. So, okay, great. So now let's look at this, right? All of a sudden, we still are getting a little bit of access to the Toronto, but now we've got Detroit stacks that are popping. We've got Baltimore stacks that are popping. We've got a range of 5 stacks that are showing up here. We've got one Toronto lineup. Let's see what Scherzer looks like. We've got a little bit more Scherzer now, right? A little bit. We've got 55% Scherzer. And the reason why is because it's almost like a scale, right? The builder wants to use Scherzer in Toronto. Those two players are extremely highly projected tonight. They are in great spots, right? As we lower our exposure to Toronto in the form of reducing that team's projection, we get a little bit more access to Scherzer because we only have to fade so much ownership. And by dropping Toronto a run and a half almost here to get them down to the next projected team, we allow ourselves to get a little bit more Scherzer because we're not using the chalkiest stack. And then we can go in here and maybe we do the same philosophy we had before, right? Let's go ahead and see. Let's remove some of these minor stacks from Toronto. And we're still going to capture the top end upside of that team. We have 2 Toronto lineups. Maybe we're okay with that here. We've gotten even a little bit more Scherzer now here. We're matching the field of what we expect the field to do because we've reduced a lot of the Toronto bats. And at this point, we still have one single Toronto lineup where we're getting Scherzer, right? And let's go ahead and look at what that lineup is. So that lineup's ranked 9. Another tool we talked about in our video yesterday is then go ahead and look. One thing you can do, maybe you really want to just finally completely eliminate lineups where Scherzer and Toronto are grouped together, is maybe we go take a look at Scherzer lineups that are in our pool that are unused. Wait, hang on. Okay, so we've edited some exposures here. So let's go ahead and see if we can now find maybe a lineup where, hang on, I'm getting ahead of myself here. What we talked about yesterday when Max was on stream here is looking into your unused pool, especially at lineups that are just missing the cut, right? We're talking about lineups that are ranked 22, 25, just outside that pool of 20, and looking at what their Saber score is compared to the lineups that are in your pool, right? So it looks like this last lineup where Scherzer and Toronto are grouped together had a Saber score of about 98.7. We're not making a great sacrifice here by maybe just deselecting that lineup. And we can do that here. Let's pull it back up here. And eliminating that lineup from our pool. You can use this option to say fill to 20. Oh, let's see. It wants to clear the filters. That's fine. And see what comes back in. And maybe it is another. There you go. So it refilled. This lineup has a Toronto 5 stack. It brought another 5 stack back in our pool. It doesn't have Scherzer. And we've kind of, again, gotten our exposures where we want them to be, right? The way we did this is we identified the context of the slate. And I think maybe one thing I'm kind of skipping here is doing that slate research from scratch, right? We talked about yesterday in our video, you can run a chalk build is what we were calling it, where you set your sliders all to 0 and then set a stack rule as a 5 stack. And I would almost certainly say what's likely to come out of this is Scherzer plus Toronto. And then what you can do is run a upside build basically to see what the different stack opportunities are that have upside by running a build where you maybe turn ownership fade off and max out smart diversity and get an idea of what some of the best stacks look like. And then applying the tools that we've learned by editing ownership and editing projections and editing exposures to get lineups that we feel are very strong for the contest that we're going to play, right? So everything kind of comes together here. And I think what is kind of implied by this question here is, why can't I just say I don't want Toronto bats and Scherzer together in the same lineup? And that is a fair question. I was kind of thinking about that this morning as well when I was out doing my morning walk with my dog. And I think that's a very useful thing to be able to do, right? And that's how a lot of traditional optimizers are going to solve this problem. A sharp player that maybe sits down with just a mean projected optimizer tool that has some of the traditional tools you'll see here might just set a rule to ungroup those two players, right? You can't use Scherzer and you can't use a stack of Toronto in the same lineup. And I think that's fine. In fact, we are planning on in a near future update to the app, adding some more robust tools pre-build to do some of those things with groups and say that. But what you really miss out on in that particular way of doing your lineups is nuance, right? By instead editing team projections and ownership and exposures to really dial in the lineups, you allow for certain things to happen where when you reduce the projection of Toronto, you get a little bit more access to Scherzer. And you have the opportunity to find where these breakpoints are, right? Where is it exactly that the builder wants to land on Scherzer when you have him at 65% owned? Well, it's matching the field, right? And when you have these big heuristic rules of thumbs, like don't use Scherzer and don't use Toronto in the same lineup, you lose a lot of that subtle nuance. You lose some of the value of being specific to your contest size. And I think by using the tools that we've been talking about here of editing projections and ownership and exposures, and then dialing in some of the actual lineups you end up using, you get to capture a lot more of that that nuance. And projections and lineups are a pretty complicated system, right? We have all these players with different salaries, and we need to stay under a certain salary cap here. And adjusting one thing dynamically ends up affecting something else in your lineup. And that's really where the power of SaberSim starts to shine, by capturing all of that and building you the best lineups possible for the contest you're playing. So, Shiver Me Ginger, I don't know if you're watching this here today or not. Let me know if that was helpful. Again, I think we can use the tools we talked about in yesterday's video to determine how we feel about the slate. What's the popular construction going to be? What are most players going to do? What do traditional optimizers want to do with this slate? Then we look and see where are the opportunities for additional upside. I think if we had run that build at max smart diversity, teams that would probably be popping are the teams that we are actually getting a lot of stacks of that are maybe lower owned options like Detroit or Baltimore. And then using the tools we have, the how to actually add the value here by editing projections, editing ownership, editing exposures to get the lineups we want. And what I just walked through here is probably very reminiscent of how my actual approach would end up being for a slate like this, right? So I think that's a good way to go through this. And if you have any follow-up questions there, let me know. I think you mentioned here, is the only way to do this to rerun a build without Scherzer? I think that's also a fine approach. I know there were some users chiming in yesterday in our video that were talking about doing that, where they'll break down, instead of using one large build and tweaking projections and exposures until it's really dialed in, they'll break their builds down and maybe say, if I know I only want 65% Scherzer, maybe you build just 13 lineups where Scherzer's in the pool and then take him out and run another build of 7 lineups where he's excluded. I think that's fine. Again, I think that's a little bit more of a brute force method that doesn't allow for as much nuance or as much flexibility here, but there's definitely different options. There's different strategies here to go about doing this. So in summary, right, you've got maybe a pitcher and a stack that you don't really want to use together. I recommend applying the strategies that we've learned here of editing team projections, updating ownership, and then tweaking your exposures in step 3 to really dial in and get the lineups that you want. And I think what we've got here is a great looking build that I think you could probably enter in contests and is well leveraged for those size of contests. So I see this question just came up. Isn't Toronto at Baltimore likely postponed? It's looking like it could be. So definitely keep an eye on the weather today. I think these lessons here still make a lot of sense for any slate, right? Regardless of what ends up happening with Toronto and Baltimore today. Maybe the weather concerns there does create a situation where you're more willing to drop a team down aggressively like this, right? And play the under there on Toronto, knowing that they have a floor of 0 essentially in the case of a postponement. But keep an eye on the weather and look out as the day goes on here. So great question though, and a good opportunity to kind of allow the content we've been putting out there to build on each other in terms of building an effective process. So. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and just keep us rolling here. Got a question here from Jeff. On shorter slates like today, do you normally limit stacks to one of the following 5-2, 4-2, 5-1-1-1, especially in single entry? Max actually answered this question or a very similar question yesterday on our show as well. I think in general, Max and I both don't really like to limit our stacks very much. We've been talking a lot about stacking and correlation lately. And the reason why, let's go ahead and just run this. So we do have a bit of a shorter slate today. Let's run a single entry build and see what we're getting out of this. So let's just say a traditional single entry contest, maybe under 10K. And let's give ourselves 10 lineups to take a look at. Oh, actually, I want to reset everything back. So let's go ahead and just reset and go back to kind of factory settings here and run another build and see what we're getting out of this. And while this is building, I'll kind of mention a point that we've been talking about here a lot recently is the traditional language around stacking that you hear around the industry a lot of you have to 5-stack on DK and you have to 4-stack on FanDuel comes from the fact that traditional optimizers have only one tool to deal with the effects of correlation in baseball, and that is by setting a manual stacking rule, right? So the reason you hear you should 5-stack on DK for baseball is heavily in part because the only way you can really manage to take into account the impacts of correlation with a traditional tool is by doing so. But because we leverage our simulation data, I reset the projections and reset my minor adjustments here as well. Because we leverage our simulation data to come up with real correlation values for different players that are in the actual lineup, combined with our lineup optimizer, which takes into account the effects of correlation that fit the contest type you are playing, we're going to build lineups that have stacks that make sense right out of the gate. In single entry, I think you're going to find that the effects of correlation are a little higher. The slider is a little bit higher on single entry contests because when everyone is just playing a single lineup, the winning lineup in that contest is going to be a bit further away from the mathematical optimal. So we can rely on the tool of correlation and build bigger stacks because if you 5-stack the team that has the highest run total, if you just have 5 pieces from that game, you're likely to do very well in that tournament regardless, right? And you'll see we get those kinds of right stacks here right out of the gate. Let's compare that to what kind of stacks we were getting on a 20 max build that maybe had a little bit of a lower correlation value. We see some 5-2s start to trickle in there. If you run a build at 150 max, you'll really start to see, let's actually just do that because I have time to kind of dive into these here today. Correlation now comes down to 5, right? Instead of 7, we need to get closer to the mathematical optimal to win a contest that is 150 max or maybe 40,000 entrants, right? So let's run this. This will take a minute just to build all these lineups, but let's go ahead and take a look at this. And we're probably going to see a little bit more diverse stacking types here. And let's go ahead and let this run. And again, the reason why you may get more diverse stacks, you may get teams that aren't as stacked as tightly. You might have some 4-3s in here, some 4-2s, might even have some like 3-3-2s, is because we need to start to really, to win a contest of this size and of this type, we need to get a little bit closer to what that mathematical optimal lineup is for this slate. And if we have a number of teams that maybe have their 75th percentile outcome and a number of players that have their 90th percentile outcome, right? We need to start pulling in those different players, and we need to more value the effects of upside and a little bit lower value the impacts of correlation in our lineups. And that's exactly what your sliders are going to do for you at the default settings, right? And this is exactly what I mean, where a traditional optimizer is not going to be able to capture any of this nuance. Mandatory 5 rule in your lineups is going to could potentially on a really big contest actually reduce some of the EV of your lineup pool overall by blocking you from lineup constructions that have win equity in the contest, like 4-3s or 3-3-2s or something like that, because of your lineup rule. So that is also why typically I don't like to use our manual stacking rule very much. I know some users find a lot of success for it. I think it can be useful if you know that you want to go in running 5 stacks, but allowing the builder to build different lineup constructions by just relying on the baseline correlation slider, I think is probably the best strategy. So this build is wrapping up here now. Let's take a look at what we've got. And you can see exactly as I said, right? We're starting to get some of these more diverse stacks in here. And these lineups have win equity in a contest of this size, 150 max or something like that, big mini max type contest, right? So we don't want to necessarily exclude these. They are going to give you unique lineup constructions. They may give you they'll give you more access to low on one-offs, which a lot of times can be important for winning these kinds of contests. But wrapping around here, I know the question was in particular for single entry. In single entry, we really can rely on the effects of correlation pretty heavily. You'll find running single entry builds on SaberSim is generally going to have a high correlation level, which means you're probably going to end up with big 5-3, 4-4 type stacks anyway. So you'll get those kinds of stacks you would like right off the bat. So let me know if that was helpful, Jeff. If you have any other questions here, I think I do see there was a follow-up here. Yep, that's why I'm interested in the shorter slates. I'm not sure if you were actually talking about the early slate. We had a 3-game early, which was even a smaller slate here. And let's talk about that briefly here since I've got the time for it. So we can now talk about this. And what we're actually going to see here is that correlation comes down even a little bit more for these smaller slates, like even down to a 3-game slate or a 2-game slate or a 4-game slate. And that makes sense to us too, right? 2 reasons. One, when there's just less players in the pool, the work that smart diversity is doing for you is going to naturally lead you to certain stacks, right? So as a reminder, what smart diversity does at higher levels is it uses smaller bins of game simulations to determine each player's projection when building every single lineup that we're building, right? So if we build a lineup here for this 3-game slate, and it is a case where Arizona has a ceiling outcome and maybe they score 10 runs or something like that, when we're building that individual lineup, you're going to end up with a lot of Diamondbacks. That's probably something resembling a stack. So we don't need to weight the impact of correlation as highly. And then secondarily, because there are just less players in the pool, lineups that win tournaments in DFS are likely to be closer to the mathematical optimal. So the effects of correlation come down, right? We need to allow ourselves the opportunity to build lineups that maybe are a little less stacked or something like that to approach the mathematical optimals that win these kinds of lineups that are in 3-game slates. So hopefully that makes some sense there. I know it's kind of really diving deep into correlation theory and some of these things. Again, I've mentioned it before when talking about some of these topics here is the sliders that we use for particular contest types are data-driven, back-tested slider settings based on EV, right? So we'll take actual slates that ran, look at certain contest sizes and types, and see what the most effective lineups are for winning those contests, what the highest EV lineups are for winning those contests. So what that means is that we can actually rely on the default sliders to kind of check our assumptions on how correlated should I be on a 3-game slate versus a 9-game slate, right? Well, we actually back tested that, and we can reference the sliders to check our intuition about how we feel about those slates, right? And same thing with ownership fade and so on. So really useful tool in terms of kind of checking your intuition and your understanding of how well stacked you should be and what kind of lineup constructions make sense for certain contests and slate types and things like that is by looking at these back-tested data-driven default sliders. So I think this is a very good follow-up question on some of the same topics here. So Edward asked, how much money is too much to spend on DK pitching? And that is another thing where I'm going to jump back to the main slate here, where it's very slate dependent, right? And when I'm talking about the inputs that you're giving to the builder here in the forms of your projections and your ownership and the individual player salaries that are set for that night, this is a complex system that isn't always very easy for a human to look at and determine what is optimal, right? And that's kind of why optimizers exist. DFS is a complicated game, and the computer optimizers allow us to take all of these inputs and quickly build what it feels like are optimal lineups for a certain contest. So I would say a really strong approach to answering this question overall on a slate-to-slate basis is, again, by running that test build and seeing what the builder thinks makes sense. And so let's go ahead and let's run another one just for the hell of it here. And you can get an idea of what the builder makes sense. And there's going to be slates where there are 15 games on the slate and the builder wants to use 2 aces, right? Maybe there's a lot of cheap stacks that have upside, and it makes sense to play 2 of those pitchers together, or on a 15-game slate or something like that, or even it doesn't really matter what the slate size is. Maybe there's aces up top, but you're finding that you're getting more lineups with lower salary pitchers, right? And more expensive bats. And this problem is not something that maybe is very easy to blanket statement solve. And again, I'm kind of beating a dead horse here, but that's also what a traditional optimizer is going. That's the only way a traditional optimizer is going to be equipped to deal with this problem as well, right? I know a lot of optimizers out there maybe have a way that you can set a minimum salary for your pitchers to use or a maximum salary for your pitchers to use. And you don't really have to do that here, right? So you can see the lineup constructions that are coming out here just with the default build. We're using typically some combination of one of these 2 aces up top and then access to the 8,500-ish price pitchers. A fairly moderate approach to pitching salary here overall, probably because there are affordable bats, I assume, in the form of Baltimore, 3 stacks and 2 stacks in here to get some salary relief, right? There might be, if we played this exact same slate, but maybe lineups were different or salaries were slightly different, it might make sense that there were builds where playing Scherzer and Darvish together were optimal and had win equity in the contest. And you would see that come out in your test build. So I think there's maybe, as opposed to thinking of, I don't want to spend more than 1,700 total on pitching, it's a good idea to run these test builds, take advantage of the lineup builder to get an idea of what lineup constructions are viable. And this also, especially as you're really starting to kind of build out your process, this can be a way to get some leverage on the field as well, right? I think what would be interesting here is, I wonder if, so let's run, trying to think about the best way to do this. Maybe it's just best to explain it, right? You can see by filtering here that we don't have any Scherzer plus Darvish lineups together. And let's run what we were calling our chalk build yesterday. So let's go ahead and see and try to get an idea of what the field is likely to do. So what we're doing here is we're turning all of our sliders down, right? We're building mean optimal lineups. And we've just set a stack rule to make a 5-stack mandatory, right? This is what maybe a traditional optimizer might build for you if you just plugged in projections, set a minimum stacking rule, and let's see what the lineup constructions look like. And what I'm expecting to see here is probably a lot of Scherzer, as we mentioned before. And you can identify lineup constructions that maybe are going to be unpopular and find some leverage on the field in terms of your lineup construction. So I think there are 2 constructions here, and we'll wait for this to finish, that I think are probably going to be pretty rare tonight, but still have a lot of upside. And they are Scherzer plus Darvish, for example, right? I think it's unlikely, especially with how expensive Toronto is, it's unlikely that we are going to get a lot of So you can see, yeah, so we're getting a lot of Scherzer. I think two lineup constructions that are unlikely to be popular tonight are Scherzer plus Darvish because of the cost of the Toronto bats, and vice versa, neither Scherzer nor Darvish, right? And we've identified already that the builder likes those secondary pitchers like Maile and Taewon Walker. So we have high upside pitchers that are a little less expensive here. And we've got obviously the upside of the aces. So I think you can start experimenting and starting to try to build out some lineups that maybe have different lineup constructions, right? We're not thinking so much of player ownership here. We're thinking about like lineup ownership. Scherzer and Darvish are unlikely to be paired together a lot tonight. I think neither of them appearing in a lineup are also likely to be rare constructions. I think most players are going to play one or two of those pitchers. And using the tool again to help us in our research here is a really great way to add value to your process, to learn a little bit more about the slate, to get a little bit additional context, right? I think from here, I don't see any other questions coming in, so I'm just going to keep riffing here. What you can then do is then ask the builder, again, using the same themes we learned from yesterday, are those constructions really viable? And we can do that by doing our high smart diversity build. So let's go ahead and build. What we're doing here is we've turned ownership fade off. We're treating ownership as agnostic. We've got smart diversity maxed out at 10, right? So we're looking essentially at lineups that are potentially likely to be optimal if the slate played out, 500 times or something like that. So let's go ahead and look at this, and we can then kind of ask the builder here, I'm interested in getting a little bit different from a lineup construction standpoint tonight on my pitchers. Are Darvish plus Scherzer lineups or lineups that have neither Darvish or Scherzer viable? And let's go ahead and see if we get any of those out. So we'll let this build run. Okay. So one thing I like to do is expand my player pool a little, or my lineup pool overall a little bit, and maybe look at the top half of lineups we built and start seeing what kind of makes sense. And let's go ahead and filter Scherzer. And we don't see any lineups where Scherzer and Darvish are paired together. So what the builder is saying is that looking at just, again, this is a rather small pool. You could do this looking at a full pool of 1,500. But it's saying that lineup construction actually doesn't really present itself in the top 250 optimals here, where Scherzer and Darvish are paired together. And then now let's look and see if we can see any lineups. How many lineups do we have where neither of those two pitchers are used together? And it's actually quite a few, right? So you can see, obviously, we pair Maile with Darvish and Scherzer quite a bit, but there are 10 or so lineups here where he's paired with Taewon Walker. And then, of course, all these other lineups where you are getting all these other pitchers, right? So that might be a way to find some leverage in the form of your roster construction. And again, we don't need to have a brute force approach here necessarily of just Xing these guys out, but maybe our approach is to reduce their projections, bring these guys down a little bit. Let's see. Maybe we equalize them to the next best pitcher, which is Maile. So let's go ahead and maybe put them at 21. And we think they're going to be very highly owned. We think the most popular constructions are going to be using both of these players. Let's go ahead and boost them up a little bit. If we think that wait, I was looking at this wrong. Yeah, no, that's right. So we think that Scherzer and Darvish are maybe going to be both highly owned. Let's go ahead and say, let's assume that there's one of them in every single lineup. I think this would work, something like this. And we've reduced them down. And run another build here. I told you we were going to be running a lot of builds today. And start to see if we can get a little bit of leverage on the field just by our lineup construction. We're going to try to get some different lineups that are unlikely to be played purely from a roster construction standpoint around pitching salary, right? I want to kind of make sure, reel this in, make sure I'm still answering the question here. I know we've gone a little bit high level maybe for what the original question was asking here, but I think it's an interesting topic. And again, what we've allowed ourselves here is nuance. and we've allowed ourselves, we've given ourselves an opportunity to provide inputs to the builder and then ask it what it feels are viable. So we'll let this run, and maybe we can fine tune this a little bit on our exposure side as well. Okay. Okay, so we're still getting a fair bit. Actually, I think this was supposed to come down, and it didn't. There we go. Okay. So now you can see we're starting to get some more different pitching exposures, right? We still have access to some of these expensive pitchers. What do we have here? Half of our lineups still have one or the other. You could reduce this further and maybe say that maybe we only want to play 10% of each of these guys, right? And we're getting unique constructions here that we think are probably unlikely to be played based on what we saw from our chalk build, right? This isn't the construction that most people are going to rush to, and that we saw from our upside build that has viability for a contest of this size tonight. So, and now maybe we're even feeling right. Of course, these pitchers themselves are likely to be independently used often, right? Because they pair very nicely with guys like Scherzer and Darvish. But this combination is maybe likely to be a little less popular because we already know that the field is going to gravitate heavily to this ace and $85 range pitcher that we are getting by a little bit. So all very interesting, all very fun stuff. I know one thing that would be very useful here would be to add, and it's something that has come up before. It's something that we're maybe hoping to implement in the future, to add a little bit more options with this filtering tool to just start actually eliminating certain roster constructions, right? Or if you filter by a certain player, maybe you filter by Scherzer and then could eliminate that you don't want to pair Scherzer together with Walker, who is probably likely to be a popular combination played together. That's something that I think I can definitely see how that'd be useful. It's something that we'd like to implement in the future. But for now, again, using the tools that we've got here allow you a lot more of that nuance of dealing with the complicated system of building DFS lineups effectively with the tools that we have here. So. All right. What other questions do we have, guys? We are zooming along here. We've got 12 minutes or so left. I say it every time. This show always goes so fast. I get excited here talking through some of this stuff, having an opportunity to play around with this. Always does a lot for my own personal research process for any given slate, right? I feel like I'm better equipped now to tackle even this slate tonight. And again, the purpose of the show is never to be, this is how you should attack the slate tonight, right? We like to use the slates we have going on any given night as an example because they're useful. They're fresh in everyone's mind. They provide practical examples that we can use here. You don't need to necessarily rush over to SaberSim and do these different things that I've discussed here on this slate in particular tonight. But this should give you some of the tools of how to use this information on any given slate and build effective lineups, right? And really, we kind of almost handled this in two different directions, right? We handled at first this idea that we don't want to pair Scherzer and Toronto together and talked about some of the tools and the opportunities that we have to do that. And then secondarily here, now we're talking about a way to get a little bit different in our pitching construction overall and different ways to attack the slate, right? Different perspectives on what you think is viable. Let's see if I can find my upside build again here. Which one was that? It was this one. I think that the power of running a build like this is it's immense, right? And your conclusions that you draw from running a build like this, right, where we're looking at kind of the optimals might be different and they're going to be unique to you. And that's what's so cool here. You might look at this and say, oh, wow, you know what? A lineup construction that has viability in the contest tonight that I don't think a lot of people are going to do is playing neither Scherzer or Darvish in the lineup, right? Or you might have looked at this and said, okay, Toronto obviously appears in a lot of these top optimals, but if 56%, or actually let's look at our 5 stacks, right? Like, yeah, sure. 15%, our biggest 5 stack is Toronto, but only 15% of the time are they an optimal 5 stack. Look at all these other teams that show up, right? So maybe Toronto isn't going to be my favorite stack. And you can come up with a lot of different conclusions from running a build like this, and then combining this with your chalk build to understand what the field is going to do and find leverage on the field. So I don't see any other questions rolling in here. Give this a couple minutes. Anyone have any quick questions or anything you want to fire off here while we've got the time to talk here today? We will be back, of course, tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern every day, Monday through Friday. I'm here answering questions, talking through this stuff live on stream. So if you think of something as soon as I hop off, which is exactly what I would do, right? That seems to always happen to me. I realized what question I wanted to ask, or as soon as I started messing around with lineups here at like 1 o'clock or something like that, I realize I'm confused by something or whatever. You can always fire those questions off into the Office Hours channel in Slack, and I will get to them live on stream tomorrow. I think it is looking pretty quiet here. I think this might be a good place to leave it off. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. Again, back again right here, 2 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. If you have questions for me, if you think about something as you're building lineups in your contests tonight, fire it off in the Office Hours channel in Slack, and I'll make sure to get to it early in the stream tomorrow. If you are not in Slack already, again, always in the description of all of our Office Hours videos on YouTube. Highly recommend joining up in Slack. Good luck on everybody's contest tonight. I hope this was helpful. If you watch this back as a recording and I talked through something in a way that didn't totally make sense, you weren't totally clear on it, you can ask that question in Slack or fire it off as an email, support@sabersim.com. Again, good luck everybody tonight, and I will see you guys all again tomorrow. Take care.